Welcome, viewers. Today, we have another special guest from the North, Dr. Andreas Østhagen, who is a senior research fellow at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Oslo, Norway, which is a research institute concerned with international environment, energy, resource management, politics, and law. Dr. Østhagen is also a senior fellow at the Arctic Institute, Washington, D.C., and also an affiliated senior advisor at the High North Center at Norway University Business School. Dr. Østhagen is also a Fulbright Fellow at the Polar Institute at Wilson Center, and he's also a professor of international relations at Bjørknes University, if I can pronounce that right. Dr. Østhagen also teaches a course called Geopolitics of the Arctic. Dr. Østhagen, we would like to welcome you to the Geostrata. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Great. So I would just like to start off with this question. What makes you invest so much in terms of academic and as well as professional capital into specifically the Arctic region?
I mean, it's a twofold answer to that question. I mean, first of all, the changes that have been occurring in the Arctic over the last decade or two requires that we study it, that we look at the dynamics there and try to describe what's happening in the Arctic. And at the same time, I mean, the Arctic is important or has been important for northern countries, for Norway, where I am and I am from as well, for Canada, where I've studied, or the US, where I've lived, or Russia as well. The Arctic has been important for much longer than just a few decades. So it makes sense in many ways also if you live in the north to also study security dynamics northwards. But it's really the changes that has occurred over the last few decades that have prompted, say, more interest in the Arctic and why the Arctic has become a whole, say, subfield on its own, at least in terms of security and geopolitics.
Great. And I see you have been engaged in a project called OceanGov, and in that you have tried to sort of understand Arctic's dynamics by combining international law and international relations. Could you tell us something about that, as well as the current security position or the risk architecture of the Arctic?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the ocean governance project that you refer to is trying to tease out specific ocean governance dynamics in the Arctic and compare them more broadly. I mean, if we start with the former, I mean, the dynamics within the Arctic, it's kind of important to highlight that, or you could at least separate it into three different domains or different dimensions. The one being, say, the intra-regional dimensions in the Arctic amongst the Arctic countries. I mean, there's 8 Arctic countries, the 5 Nordic countries: Norway, Finland, Sweden, Iceland, and Denmark, which is an Arctic country via Greenland. Those are the 5 Nordic countries. Then you have Russia, Canada, and the United States, right? So in total, you have 8 Arctic countries. And between these countries, or amongst them, you have cooperation on everything from economic development to dealing with climate change, indigenous affairs, search and rescue, etc. And that cooperation has been ongoing for 3-4 decades now already, but due to the increased attention given to the Arctic that relates to climate change, that also relates to, say, focus on the resource potential and the shipping potential via the Arctic, these countries have collaborated even more. You have new agreements for dealing with, say, the potential emergency at sea, or you have new agreements on research. The Arctic Council has emerged as this rather important regional fora. So to say that, on one level, kind of the international regional level, you have a rather positive dynamic amongst the Arctic countries. Of course, this has changed a little bit with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Arctic Council was suspended for some time, and now it's talk about resumption, but without Russia. So this regional dynamics that had proved rather resilient in face of say, conflict elsewhere, 2014, the Russian annexation of Crimea, then the Arctic Council still continued its work. Now we're seeing more disruption amongst the Arctic states, but still those fundamental shared interests, those agreements that were signed, and it's likely also the agreements will be signed in the future, highlights how kind of that on the kind of an Arctic specific level, you have a certain set of political dynamics. Those are very different from, say, the strategic or systemic dynamics that also impact the Arctic region. And this is really where the Arctic has become so much more important in the geopolitical sense over the last few years, not because of ice melting, really, not because of its economic potential, but because of the Arctic's, say, location, or its geographical location as this buffer region between the North American continent, the European continent, and Russia, Siberia. The fact that Russia has been investing a lot in its Northern Fleet, which is located in the Arctic, which is important to Russia's strategic ambitions more globally, and also the increasing global competition or strategic rivalry, if you will, between the US and China, that also has an Arctic component, because the US is in the Arctic and China has shown an Arctic interest. Point just being that you need to at least separate between these two different, say, dynamics, the intra-regional and the strategic. And then you could even also even talk about the national, the specific, each specific Arctic country, Norway, for example, where I'm sitting right now, and how Norway's security interests, geopolitical interests might not be the same as the Canadian ones or the Russian ones. That was a long backstory, but point being that you have different dynamics at different levels. And what we're trying to do in some of the research that I'm doing is to look at, let's say, for example, law of the sea, right? The primacy of law of the sea, that really is what gives the Arctic countries the rights that they have in the Arctic, and in many ways is what contributes to or underlines the stability of the Arctic region. Does the presence of the law of the sea or the provisions in the law of the sea, does it have the same effect in, for example, the South China Sea or the East China Sea or the Black Sea or the Mediterranean? So it's of interest naturally to look at the Arctic specifically because of the reasons I mentioned, but also I think it's important to tease out the similarities between the Arctic and other parts of the world, and also perhaps also tease out why the Arctic is relevant to other parts of the world, right? Because the Arctic is interesting in and of its own, but how it links to global competition is also interesting.
Great. And also, we as students of IR, or even as general observers in the global south, India, and so on, we tend to sweep over like Arctic, it's the Arctic region or the Arctic security community. I know you've written something on this, like the levels of analysis and how it is not necessary that the component countries making the Arctic might always share their security interests with each other. Like, is there really a convergence, or if not, then do you see a convergence in these interest calculus of the Arctic countries after the Ukrainian invasion, or or is it really what you're being called a one single coherent region, or how is it playing out in terms of levels of analysis? Could you please throw some light on this for students of international relations?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, not to become too theoretical, but it brings us into the whole idea of what is a region. Inherently, we think of it as a geographically bounded part of the world. The Arctic is not really geographically bounded because of its extreme vastness, the size of the Arctic, right? It's, it includes 3 different continents. It's a massive area. It's rather inaccessible. And the variation just in climate, population, economic potential, human activity, the variation is also extreme compared to many other parts of the world that you would call a region. But I think there's no doubt that if you're a climate scientist, or if you study polar bears, or you study, say, sea ice and how the impact of global warming is more generally on say the nature at large, but also nature in the polar regions, you could definitely define the Arctic as a region, as a coherent region. What I'm questioning and have questioned in a few of my articles is whether or not that's as valid when it comes to security, not human security or environmental security. You know, those are highly relevant aspects of security in the Arctic, right? Maybe even more so than in other parts of the world because of the rapid changes in the Arctic taking place, and also because the communities are few and sparse, and the distances are great. But if you look at traditional security, if you look at state security, the fear of survival as a state, does it then make sense to say that the Arctic is a coherent region, i.e. that the security concerns of the Arctic states are more or less aligned, or there's a spillover? And I mean, you're into a point that there might be ongoing convergence, perhaps, you know, and as the ice is increasingly melting, and, you know, within a few decades, we'll have completely ice-free summers in the Arctic. The North Pole will just be a point in the sea. Perhaps that is contributing to a convergence, so that Canada and, say, Norway or Russia are kind of operating within the same security region. But right now, I'm not really seeing it. I'm seeing that you should at least divide it into two separate domains. I mean, on the one hand, you have the European part of the Arctic, or call it the North Atlantic part of the Arctic. So then that includes, of course, you know, the North Atlantic Nordic countries. I mean, Iceland, Denmark via Greenland, the Faroe Islands, Norway, to some extent, Sweden and Finland, especially now when Sweden and Finland are likely to join NATO any day now. And that includes also Russia. And within that domain, within that security region, if you will, Russia is the main antagonist. Russia is the main security concern for all these Nordic countries, right? That's been the case since the end of the Second World War. It's been how to deal with a Russian neighbor, and especially a Russian neighbor that since 2003, 2004, 2005, under Vladimir Putin, has been reinvesting in its military capacities in the north, both because of issues in the north and because of strategic issues, nuclear submarines, ballistic missiles, etc., as we talked about earlier. And that region even extends into down south into the UK, right? So you get the Scottish, the general UK interest in the Arctic links to that because of, say, security concerns in the UK linked to Russia. And those dynamics are very different than what we see in the North American parts of the Arctic. Thinking particularly of the Canadian North, but also to some extent about Alaska, and also to the western parts of Greenland, where Russia is much further away. Yes, Russia is sending now and again some bombers to showcase their capabilities, but there's no immediate threat from Russia. There's no fear of invasion. There's no security concern in the same way as you see in the Nordic parts of the Arctic. That's not to say that there are not concerns or issues that these North American Arctic countries need to deal with, but they're of a very different character, or very different, say, urgency than what you see in the European Nordic part of the Arctic. And I think it's just important that when we think about the geopolitics, which inherently is the combination of geography, right, which in the case of the Arctic is changing, and politics, but with a focus on say, rivalry, chance of conflict. I think it's just important that we recognize the different dynamic that takes place in this, you know, larger area that we call the Arctic.
And there is recently a lot of interest in the Arctic from Russia and China in terms of investments, mining, fisheries, and so on. How is this being perceived in the Arctic?
I think that the perception has changed a bit over the years. If we go back 15, 20 years, when the Arctic was really on the agenda initially in the Arctic countries, not even all of the Arctic countries, I think some were more forward-leaning than others. Norway, Russia, Canada, perhaps the most Arctic engaged countries. There was a lot of optimism. There was this idea that you would have investments, not only from countries external, but also internally. You would have investments northwards. You know, there was talk about oil boom, resource boom in the north. Not this idea of, say, a resource race that never made sense if you look at ownership and you look at the law of the sea and all those things. But still, there was an optimism and a positive approach when it came to the Arctic and investments. And also, I think to some extent, also looking to actors outside the region, especially China. Ideas of Chinese investments in the north being a driver of a positive development. But alas, that's changed quite a bit over the recent years. I mean, the increased global competition that you could probably tell me even more about, right? With China, and whether we see it as a bipolar world or just a multipolar world where China is obviously throwing its weight around more. India is really emerging as well, as a future superpower and even with an Arctic interest, right? And this idea of the fall of the West, which hasn't really happened and is probably not going to really happen. And then Russia's kind of belligerency under Vladimir Putin and everything that happened in Ukraine. And the combination of all these things, I think, have made also the dividing lines in the Arctic more clear. And in the Western countries, which are, I mean, if you look at the 8 Arctic countries, 7 of them belong to the so-called West. 7 of them are NATO members or soon to be NATO members. So there's been much more skepticism of investments, especially coming from China. Questions about, the long-term strategic purpose of Chinese investments, geoeconomics, if you will, as a concept. Using economic means, but for geopolitical purposes. And at the same time, I think there's also been a sobering of expectations, not only when it comes to foreign investments, but also nationally in each Arctic country. It's been a realization that there is a lot of potential in the Arctic. Might not be a resource boom in the way that some envisioned 20 years ago, but there's more nuance and more sobriety to it. So I just think that we've kind of reached a phase now where that initial interest in the Arctic, where everything was described in one-liners and there was all this optimism and hype, has turned into, we went into a period of, say, a bust idea, and then people saying, "No, the Arctic, it wasn't that interesting after all." And now we're in a different phase where there's definitely interest in the Arctic, but it's nuanced and there's different parts of the Arctic, and we're also recognizing that the Arctic also holds a place not only in terms of resource development and investments, but also in terms of strategic competition and strategic forces, which then kind of adds to the whole complexity of the region.
Building on this, it's a conjectural question. And do you think the distinctiveness of the Arctic is kind of fading away insofar as the Arctic's co-optation into this clash of countries, like clash between the USA and Russia and China bloc is concerned? Is the distinctiveness fading? And if yes, what does this portend for the Arctic?
I think that's a very good point you're making. I mean, I would say it is fading. It hasn't faded, and I'm not sure it's ever going to completely fade. But I think you're onto something. I think 20 years ago there was a lot of talk about Arctic exceptionalism and how dynamics on that kind of regional level that I talked about in the beginning, how those dynamics could be kept separate from the strategic conflict dynamics deriving from elsewhere. And I think we've seen that faded a bit, especially now with the suspension of the Arctic Council and other forms of cooperation with Russia. It's clear that the Arctic is impacted heavily by conflict in other parts of the world, and it might even be an arena for conflict if that were to escalate further. Again, not all parts of the Arctic, but the North Atlantic, Barents Sea parts of the Arctic are so important strategically for Russia that they can't be separated out in a way of keeping the Arctic completely, say, peaceful or exceptional. But at the same time, there are some characteristics of the Arctic region that makes it different than the Caribbean or the Mediterranean or the South China Sea or Indian Ocean. I mean, there's when it comes to just as we talked about earlier, the sparse population, the limited population, the distances in the Arctic, the challenges. Yes, ice is melting, but that doesn't mean that ice is going to go completely away. The conditions are extremely difficult in wintertime, summertime as well. So fair enough, but in general, the Arctic is an inhospitable place, difficult to operate in, where in many ways, some of what we see as kind of a zero-sum competition is negated by the characteristics of the Arctic. So there's actually benefits in cooperating with, if you want to develop shipping lanes, if you want to have an economic mega project for LNG, if you want to have sustainable fisheries, if you want to have tourism, if you're interested in research to figure out what's happening in the Arctic, all of these areas require cooperation also with say countries or actors that you perceive as being kind of on the opposite side, being Russia or China or others. And I don't see that changing anytime soon because of inherently the Arctic. But yes, you're right that the Arctic is becoming dragged into more global power politics, and that in a sense also then it loses some of its exceptionalism, which was never really a good way to describe the Arctic in the first place. But it's an idea, a concept, right, that has been pushed by Arctic countries, by their foreign ministers, etc., that argue that the Arctic is exceptional and should be kept exceptional, and that's been a myth that now is not really holding up under scrutiny.
I see. And also building on this, to what extent has the European Union factored in the security considerations of the Arctic states in its security reports and so on? And how has this been changing recently?
I think the European Union probably would very much, or say proponents of the European Union would like to see a stronger security role played in the Arctic. Right now, that role is rather limited. I mean, if, as any of you know who are say students of EU foreign and security policy, you know all the problems that comes with that. I mean, it's not the EU competence exclusive, and it's not, it's still struggling. The EU is still struggling in terms of finding its role and finding its purpose. And the purpose that the EU has been developing over the last decade, if you will, is more focused on say, policing or the softer sides of security, or contributing to those dimensions. And yes, also having some form of rapid reaction deployment capacity. I mean, that's what's being discussed right now. And you could definitely argue that the invasion of Ukraine has in many ways accelerated internal EU security developments, but not with a direct Arctic link or Arctic component. I mean, if you look at which EU members are in the Arctic, of course, it's Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. Sweden and Finland now joining NATO is perhaps the ultimate signal of how it's in the division between the EU and NATO is seen, right? That NATO is the ultimate security guarantee. The EU is something else. Perhaps there could be more integration in that sense. But I think in terms of dealing with the main security concern for the Nordic countries, which inherently is beyond Canada and the US, and Canada has its special bilateral relations to the US. If the Nordic countries have a security concern, it's Russia. How do you deal with Russia? It's primarily through NATO. But perhaps you could envision that the EU takes a role as a mediator, or a role as a instigating track 2 dialogue. But I think that's even difficult with the 27 member states trying to find common approaches to things. So for now, I think the EU's role in the Arctic in terms of security is more in dealing with the softer side of things. Having capacity for emergency response, having sharing of information, also in terms of security and intelligence, and maybe trying to, if you will, raise awareness also of those things that has an economic or a financial dimension. So if we're talking about the fear of Chinese investments in the Arctic, that's not an Arctic specific problem. It's a Western or European specific problem, right? What are these investments for? Maybe there's some unwarranted fear and speculation, maybe, but some of it is warranted. There, the EU definitely has a role, right, in coordinating amongst the European countries sharing of information, sharing of best practices, and even trying to have some form of regulation that has relevance to the Arctic. And it may be especially needed in the Arctic because of the vulnerability of some of the communities in the Arctic. So I see the EU's role more along those dimensions.
Great. And I would now like to bring you to the Indo-Pacific a bit. And this question might be, provocative for an Indian audience, but we discussed how we are making sweeping statements about Arctic. Now, of late, there is this construct called the Indo-Pacific, where we are sweeping over a very broad range of geography as, a sort of potential block or a potential block which could be co-opted into the rules-based international order and international law or whatever that comes along with it. So do you see a similarity in how theorists and politicians are brushing over the Arctic region plus how that is sort of playing out, or how we can draw parallels between Arctic and the Indo-Pacific, and what this portends for the confrontation that we might see going forward between the West and Russia, China?
Mm-hmm. That's a complex question. Perhaps, maybe because I am one of my arguments or points has been the nuance of these sweeping generalizations. I'm hesitant about those when it comes to, say, the Indo-Pacific, or even just say, Southeast Asia or South Asia. And this is, what does that actually mean? What are we talking about? And, from a Norwegian perspective, I would assume that the general audience, tends to think of regions far away. If you say South Asia or the Indian Ocean, right, and people would have very little understanding of the complexities and nuances there, and tend to describe them in one-liners as well. One region that, of course, is linked to that is the Southeast Asia and the conflicts that we've seen emerged there over the last few decades, and they tend to be described in very similar, one-liner headlines. So I think that maybe this is a problem more generally for international relations, or for those of us who are doing empirical work in international relations. Right? Yes, we can talk about theory, but I find theory only relevant or interesting if it's describing and helping me solve an empirical real-world problem. Right? I'm trying to do relevant research, describing contemporary dynamics, and our job inherently, you as scholars in India or elsewhere, me as a scholar here in Norway or in the Arctic, is to inherently explain to a wider audience, the people who only have time to read the short headlines, explain the complexities and nuances, right? And I think there's a job we have to do everywhere. But I think still what's fascinating about this study of regions in itself is that you can definitely draw parallels. Although my whole argument here is that they're distinct and unique in their own right, but they also are influenced by, a region is not an island, right? They're influenced by wider global dynamics. So the question becomes then, how do we see, or how does the strategic competition between the US and China, how does that materialize in these sub-regions of international affairs? How do that global rivalry play countries up against each other? And here you would be much more of an expert than I am in terms of explaining the Indo-Pacific, or explaining the role of various Asian subregions in this. So that's a fascinating dimension. And what I mentioned earlier as well, right, that's to separate out those overarching, yes, okay, China and the US might end up in a geopolitical struggle over allegiances and resources, and who gets to invest or what in specific regions. Separate those specific things from the region-specific dimensions, whether it's law of the sea or resources. Right? That some have argued, right, that what's actually important, if you look at the resources in the South China Sea, is not oil and gas; it's fisheries, right? Fisheries are much more important and much more of a driver of conflict than oil and gas is in the South China Sea, as one dimension, right? To bring out those specific things as well, and to recognize that. And then you can even zoom down one level further and look at, okay, but what's actually the national security interests of each country, which again is, of course, influenced by overarching strategic dynamics. I mean, if in the case of India, right, of course, India has to play a role or take a position or balance out, China-US rivalry. Of course, India has to play a certain role within the regional dynamics, whether it's as a great power, as a trying to enforce its interests there, but also India has national interests, security interests that are all often related to domestic concerns, and often try to do multiple things at once. And I think it's our job as foreign policy analysts to convey a more complex picture of the world, but to try to do that in a simple manner, if that's the challenge.
Thank you so much. And you talked a lot about China in this answer, and that's very relevant. And building on that, do you think that China might or is mobilizing? Yeah, it might mobilize Arctic as an alternative route to Europe and the West, like as a launch pad or something of that sort?
No, not per se. I mean, I think the Northern Sea route, which is the primary or most immediate way of if you just look at transportation, it's not a complete alternative, right? It's not an option to stop shipping via the Malacca Strait or the Suez Canal or elsewhere. It's an addition for highly specialized products. It's an addition that links to Russian-Chinese cooperation. It might in many ways actually serve more of a geo-economic goal, or the goal of increased cooperation or collaboration between those two countries, Russia and China, that kind of finds its economic expression through the Northern Sea route, as much for geopolitical purposes as for purely financial or economic ones. So in terms of the Northern Sea route, I see it along that dimension. If you look more kind of in a wider conceptual way of say Chinese engagement with Europe, again, the Arctic is just one component, right? Europe is so many different things, and Portugal or say most Mediterranean countries care little about the Arctic, or they care about it, but not in the same way as they care about what happens in the Mediterranean or North Africa, which conveys a completely different set of political dynamics, being that if China wants to engage with those countries or engage with those issues, it has to engage there and not in the north. But it is an avenue for political influence, for political engagement with the Nordic countries, definitely, with Canada, definitely. The US, I think, is a whole different ballgame. And of course, Russia, which I've already mentioned. And I think it's a natural expression also of China's global role that is kind of increasing, and China throwing its weight around. So the fact that it's showing an interest in the Arctic when the Arctic is say increasing in strategic importance, that in itself actually contributes to more interest to the Arctic, which then increases the Arctic's strategic importance. So it's a upwards or downwards, depending on how you see it, spiral effect linked to China. And I think it's unavoidable. But that doesn't mean that there needs to be a conflict with China over the Arctic or in the Arctic. I think there's ways to alleviate those concerns. And I also think it's important to highlight that China is not an Arctic country. It doesn't have an Arctic territory. It doesn't have the same Arctic capacities or capabilities as the Arctic countries do. So it's perhaps the Chinese threat to the Arctic is a bit exaggerated or hyped, if you will. But it's definitely of interest, right? Because it links to a more global expression of rising power.
And just out of curiosity, what might be the role of Sweden or Norway and such Arctic states in countering Chinese making inroads into Arctic in a way which might not in the future favor the Arctic, as we might have seen in Sri Lanka and Africa and so on?
I mean, I think we talked a bit about it already, the need for clear regulation and clear control over investments, transparency, and avoiding investments or avoiding to open up for investments or economic ventures that might put the country's national interests or the country's regional, local interest at risk. That's one approach to it, an approach that I think is being formulated or being discussed right now in the Nordic countries. The Nordic countries being small countries, but also being rather, say, high in capacity, highly regulated countries with a large bureaucracy and quite a lot of resources that in many ways should be able to formulate proper policy to deal with those things. So perhaps a bit in a different state than some of the countries in other parts of the world that have had to deal with, say, Chinese increased interest or engagement. And at the same time, I think it's not necessarily always a competition or a strategic zero-sum thing. It can also be, there can be ways of including China in Arctic developments, whether it's through research, whether it's through law of the sea development, where China is a legitimate actor, and by including China, like for example in the Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement that was recently signed between 5 Arctic coastal states, but then 5 more or less external actors, one of them being China. And the rationale is not only that, I mean, Chinese fishing fleets could potentially be active in the Arctic, but also that including China in Arctic governance structures also commits China in some ways. And that's not bad for China, it's not bad for the Arctic. It's a way of actually not seeing everything as competition. So yeah, I think that's kind of multiple avenues to that question.
And lastly, Dr. Østhagen, how is India being perceived in the Arctic, and what might be its role in terms of your expectations or the Arctic's expectations going forward?
I think the Indian interest in the Arctic, I mean, you just launched, saying you, I don't know if you were part of it, but I know the Indian government just launched its Arctic policy or framework or strategy. I'm not sure which word they're using, but and they think there's a lot of interest in it, right? So India is definitely a newcomer in many ways. China has showed an Arctic interest in a long time. Other countries have as well. India is more of a newcomer, although it has been part of the Arctic governance structures, the Arctic Council as an observer for a while. So I think in general, there's this idea that in the Arctic community, if you will, amongst the Arctic experts, amongst the researchers like myself, the bureaucrats, the Arctic countries, there's this positive approach towards other countries showing an interest in the Arctic, because a lot of the problems in the Arctic are also, when it relates to climate change or resources that are changing or pollution, etc. These are problems that can't be solved in the Arctic. You can't ban activity in the Arctic and think that's going to solve it. The problems are made elsewhere. They're made in Europe, in Brussels or London, or in India, like in New Delhi or in Beijing, right? So in China. So point just being, it's also a global or issue or set of issues. So I think having the world's second largest country or largest country, I guess it, I don't know what the verdict is out on population numbers yet, but the world's at least soon to be largest country in terms of population. Having that engaged in Arctic matters, of course, I think that's seen as very positive. Because I think a lot of India's Arctic interest comes from research or research interest primarily. But at the same time, you also have the security dimension, right? And the kind of growth of India as a great power, as a eventual global superpower, inevitable, I don't know, superpower. I mean, that's up for you to tell me, but that also, in the same way that we've talked about China, right, and how Chinese interests in the Arctic were mentioned back in 2010, 2011, and most people didn't think much about Chinese interests in the Arctic. Thought, okay, China's interested, fine. That might provide some positive capacity to the Arctic, some political interest, fine, but not going to change much more. And you fast forward a decade, and then you see the way we talk about China in the Arctic today, with all this, some skepticism, but also some optimism, some ideas that we could collaborate more with China, and also some interest in what does China actually want in the Arctic. And I think perhaps it's not difficult to see kind of the similar path by India, not necessarily in terms of this antagonistic inherent competition that we're seeing between the West and China, but at least in the same trajectory, that small steps taken now by India when it comes to an interest in the Arctic eventually materializes, right? You get a larger and larger group of Arctic experts in India, some related to climate change and research, yes, some to economic development, participating in Northern Sea Route aspects, mineral gas development, but also some with a security focus, and thinking of how does the Arctic figure in India's global outlook, India's strategic, say, security outlook. Can the Arctic play a role there? What about submarines? What about naval vessels? What about larger, say, competition that takes the form of diplomacy and not necessarily only boots on the ground? And that's going to be fascinating to follow. So I'm very curious to see how India's Arctic role progresses in the future. So keep me updated on that.
And okay, that was the penultimate. This is the last, and this is about something personal. I'll tell you what, I actually talked with a few people, my friends, family, about what do you think about Arctic before this interview. They said before, like 10 years before, when they thought about Arctic, it was about Christmas tree, it was about ice, it was about Santa Claus. Recently, there has been a change in how people perceive the Arctic in India. It's about opportunities, melting ice, climate change, threat, opportunities, Indian interest, all of that. And you have extensively covered the Arctic concern. So how can we sort of channelize all of this research, and how can we feed all of this into policy structures, governance structures, in a way that actually acknowledges the nuances of Arctic, of regions, and in a way that we have a geopolitics which is sustainable, given the climate change, environmentalism, all of these concerns. So if you could please make a concluding remark on this, Dr. Østhagen.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I think it's along two dimensions. On the one hand, India's Arctic debate, or the debate that you have in New Delhi or Mumbai or other parts of India on the Arctic needs to increase. Having specific workshops, seminars with Arctic interested experts, with scholars who are interested in international affairs and who might also, then have an interest in the Arctic, including policymakers, decision makers in the Indian government who are actually writing India's Arctic policy. I think that's the ultimate way to go, right? And it's a boring answer, but it is the academic approach that actually also has value. The more seminars, workshops you have, the more policy briefs and papers you write, not only by us in the Arctic, but also by you, Indian scholars and Indian experts, and then doing that in tandem with, say, Arctic countries, with Arctic scholars, yes, but also developing that expertise in your own country is the way to go. And then at the same time, you also need to have those very same, say, Arctic experts, Arctic scholars in India being connected to the Arctic environment, like here in Norway, the Fridtjof Nansen Institute, or other parts of the Arctic, coming on the research visit, visiting scholars, having seminars here with Indian officials, is also an approach to take. So there's kind of that duality of just getting more Arctic in India and getting more Indians in the Arctic, if you will. And it's a long or slow process, but it's an accumulation of knowledge and accumulation of experts. And then eventually you get a much more informed debate and informed policy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Østhagen. Just to recap for our audience, so Arctic is a region which deserves a lot of nuance in discourse, just like the Indo-Pacific, if I may push that point. And going forward, I think the Indian Arctic policy needs to be shaped upon these conversations between people from the Arctic, people from India, and so on. So thank you, Dr. Østhagen, and we hope that you have a great rest of your day.